The next category of brush we're going to look into will feel totally different than the opacity brushes that I like to render with. Because there are some situations where what you're looking for is a very organic, randomized look. Maybe it's snowflakes in a snowstorm, leaves on a tree. Whatever it is, you might want to remove yourself from the process. Insert some natural randomness, and Photoshop is great at this. And also, you probably don't want to drive yourself crazy by painting each and every leaf on a tree. So for this study, we're going to look at creating some explosion debris. If you look at these reference pictures, there's an explosion, and then there's bits of flying rock, and they're very randomized. And so I'm going to use this as my guide to help make a brush that'll automate this process for me. And this fits into a category of brushes that I like to call random scatter. Before we get going on this specific scatter brush, let's create what I like to call a master brush. This brush is going to serve as a starting point to spawn the rest of the brushes that we talk about in this series. So if you were to think about it like a family tree, this master brush is going to be the trunk of the tree. Now, unlike the hard round brush, we're going to start with a transparent shape, in this case an arrow, to make this brush. So I've made this ahead of time and it's included in the texture folder if you want to use this. So I'm going to drag a marquee around this arrow, go to the edit menu and say define brush preset. And I'll go ahead and call this master. So now when I open up my brush presets, the last one on the list is the most recently created master brush. And you can see it's pretty ugly. Not really very useful at all, but it is going to serve as the base for all of our future brushes. All right, so let's talk about our flying debris brush. Looking at the reference, you can see there are little bits of stuff flying through the air, and they're all pointing in different directions. They are different scales, and they also have a little bit of motion blur to them. So let's create a list of requirements. We want this to be random. We want there to be a variety of sizes and shapes. We want them all pointing in different directions, and potentially to have a bit of tonal variation, so some light and some dark. So the first major difference between my master brush, which is what I'm going to start with, and this reference is that there's no scatter happening here. So I'm going to want to turn on scattering. And once I turn this on, you can see that it's quite a bit different. It's looking a lot more randomized, so this is good. Now before we go any further, I want to talk a little bit about each of these sub-properties. So within the scatter category, you've got a variety of different tweaks that you can change the way it scatters. So let's look at the top slider. It's just called scatter. I can set it down to the left side, which is no scatter, all the way up to a high percentage, which will give me lots of scatter. So I'll say 740% is my maximum scatter. And when I make a mark, this is what happens. Now you'll notice right below that slider, there's a drop-down menu that says Control Off. Well, these two features are tied directly together. The first one says how much, and to how much I answered 740%. The next part of that question is what controls that? What's going to cause that amount of scatter? And there's a few different options. So if I were to change this to pen pressure, what it would do, it would say with very light pressure, there's very little scatter. As I do more and more pressure, there's more and more scatter. Up to a maximum of 740%. So when you choose the slider, this is how much. And then control is what's driving it. Well, for my brush, I don't want the amount of randomness to be tied to pen pressure. So for me, I'm going to want a lot of scattering, maybe 800%, but I'm going to set the control to off. Now this is a bit confusing because when you see the word off, you'd probably think, well, I've turned off scatter. And that's not what happened here. What off means is that it will be uniformly random. No matter how hard I press with the pen, it's going to be 800% scatter. That's what off means. In my opinion, they should change the word off to always, but I'm not the one making the software. So according to my design list here, I've got the spacing down nicely, but I'm missing a lot of the other components. So next, let's make sure that all of these little bits of debris are pointing in different directions. So to do that, I'm going to activate Shape Dynamics, click on the word Shape Dynamics, and I'll change Angle Jitter. So here I have two questions. How much? And in my case, I want a lot. I'm going to say 100%. And then controlled by what? Now, since I want these to be always pointing in different directions, I don't want it to be tied to pen pressure. So I'm going to say off, or in my case, always. So when I make a mark, you can see that each of those arrows are now pointing in different directions. Awesome. But they're all the same size. So let's control size jitter. Up at the top of the list here, I'm going to have size jitter set to about 50%. But then the second half of this is called minimum diameter. So size jitter is going to change the size of each of these tips between the maximum diameter and then this second slider, which is minimum. So I'll set that all the way down to 0. So this means that I can go from tiny, tiny all the way up to very big. And if I were to set this to off in the same way, I would have a variety of different sizes. Well, that's pretty nice. But for the way I want this to work, I'm actually going to set the size to pen pressure. And now I can make small with a very light touch, all the way up to larger and larger as I press more. That'll help me paint in both the background and the foreground pretty easily. All right, we're starting to make progress here. I also want to change the relative roundness of each of these. This is so they're not all perfectly straight pointing at the camera. So I'm going to add in a little bit of roundness jitter. Change the minimum roundness to about 50%. I don't want these to get too squished. And I will keep this control set to off. So it has nothing to do with pen pressure. Let's see how this looks. All right, so some of them are squished, some of them are normal. They're pointing in different directions. It's getting pretty good. Now I want to adjust the scattering a bit. The spacing is not quite the way I like it. So to adjust the actual spacing between each of these tips, I'm going to go to Brush Tip Shape, the top of the list, and the very bottom slider is called Spacing. And I'm going to move this to the right a little bit to give them a little more breathing room. That's looking good. Maybe even a little more. All right, good. Finally, when these debris are far away in the background, I want them to be less opaque. Right now, they're all at 100% opacity. So I'm going to turn on Transfer. And in older versions of Photoshop, this is hidden in a menu called Other Dynamics. So Transfer is opacity and flow. And I want both of them set to pen pressure. So this means with light pen pressure, the individual dots will be both small, but also low opacity, like they're off in the distance. Now let's see how that looks. So now they're small, you can barely see them, and they get bigger and bigger and more visible. That's going to work great. At this point, I'm ready to call the behavior done. The brush is acting the way I want it to. The tip is all that needs to be changed. So I'll save this out, and I'll call it Work in Progress, WIP, Scatter Brush. Okay. At this point, it's time to make my tip shape. I'm going to do this in a different document. And you can obviously tell I've sped up this footage. And the reason is because this process is a bit out of the scope of the video. It's not a rendering tutorial. But all I'm doing here is making a single piece of debris. I'm keeping each of the elements layered if I want to modify it later, but it's black and white. So the black will be the tip shape, and the white will be negative space, transparency. So now that I've created a single piece of debris, this is going to be our repeat unit. This is the tip shape. So I'll drag a marquee, give it a little bit of breathing room so there's no hard edges, make a flat copy, and then go to Edit, Define Brush Preset. Now when I name this, it's got to be something that I'll remember to get rid of later. So I like to call them WIP, which is Work in Progress, and I'll say Scatter Tip Shape. Okay. So my work in progress tip shape brush is going to be ugly. If I just tap once, it looks good. If I draw a line, it looks stupid. But that's okay, because really all I need it for is that tip shape. So I'll open the brush that has the proper behavior. This is the one that scatters correctly, but looks like arrows. And in this brush tip shape, I'll look down towards the end of the list and find my piece of debris. And now each of those arrows is going to be replaced by that piece of debris from the other brush. Yeah, look at that. That is looking almost exactly how I want it. Now at this point, when you've imported the proper tip shape, you might need to make a few last minute adjustments. So maybe I'll add a little extra spacing, change the scattering a little bit, get it the way I want. But now I've joined the tip from my other brush and the behavior from this brush, and I've got something that really looks like what I was going for. But when you've got it all just right, don't forget to save the brush. This is when you hit the ever important new brush preset button, and I'll give it a name. And this is not going to be a work in progress. This is the real deal. So I'll say debris scatter brush. Okay. Now at this point, I've built up a fair number of brushes that I don't want to keep. All those ones with WIP at the front. So I'm going to go through and delete those. So I'll right click on the brush and say delete. Okay. This is sort of like cleaning house because I don't need all of those intermediary brushes. All I want is the final. So to recap real quick here, I want to focus on the idea of separating behavior from look. And it seems a little bit convoluted, but here's the reason why. Now that I've got a scatter template brush, the one with the arrows that behaves like scattering but kind of looks ugly, I can swap in different tips and turn that into any kind of scatter brush I want. And once I put in the new tip, there's really not many changes left I have to make. But by keeping that behavior and the tip shape separate, it really allows for some future modifications.